Engagers, this is Professor Game, where we interview successful practitioners of games, gamification, and game thinking who bring us the best of their experiences to get ideas, insights, and inspiration to help us in the process of using games and gamification in our daily lives, for example, to learn what we are teaching. And I am Rob Alvarez. I work at Ironhack, teach at IE Business School University, and so much more, and host this podcast. If you have an extra second, please go ahead and subscribe for free to our email list at professorgame.com/subscribe. Hey Engagers, welcome back to another episode of the Professor Game podcast, and we are today with Danielle. Danielle, before we take off, are you prepared to engage?
I can't wait. Let's go.
Let's do this because we have today with us Danielle M. Orsino, who is a fantasy novelist whose lifelong vision is to create whimsical realms that our readers can escape to. Her compelling word-weaving pays homage to a multitude of personal muses, from Chris Claremont and George Pérez, both famous comic book writers, to Anne Rice and Wonder Woman. And the creative spark of storytelling has been with her since she was a child, but also martial arts and her nursing career took center stage into adulthood. And one day, like any other, actually, I'm not going to go into this story because I think it will be interesting for you to delve into that. And that's something that we will be talking about. So I'll leave that sort of unexplored box there so we get into that throughout the interview. And that has all this story has led her to create series, including the Locked Out of Heaven, Thine Eyes of Mercy, and From the Ashes, which are published by Horsemen Publications. And with an unwavering passion for cosplay and comics, she was definitely has placed herself on the cover of each of the books in all of her Fae cosplay glory. And the Birth of Fae also features Lowe's, an affable chameleon dragon inspired by her fun-loving Yorkie named Carlos. And this new Queen of Fae's unmatched world building and masterful Fae-origin retellings have led her to an ever-growing queendom of Fae-natics. So quite a few puns in there. Danielle, I don't know if we're leaving anything out of that intro, besides, of course, that origin story of how this came to be that you want to make sure that the audience knows about.
Sounds like you got it all pretty good.
Good stuff. So Danielle, what is, being Danielle in these days looks like? I don't know, if you want to run us through one of your days, one of your weeks. I don't know. We want to sort of be there with you and get to know you a little bit better.
First of all, thank you for having me. I really appreciate it. I was looking forward to this all week. So that's, I'm always excited about these kind of things. And I think your podcast is very unique in its material and content. So thank you. My day is consumed by the veil, the world that the Fae live in, and always writing and building it out bit by bit and a little bit more. And if there's some cosplay involved, all the better. I'm always dressing up as my characters to make the world feel a little more lived in. I think it adds authenticity to it. I don't know if enough authors live in the world that they create. And I'm all about living in it, breathing it, and exploring it along with my readers. Because I think if I do it, it makes my passion for it grow and more people are going to want to visit it. And I live with two of my dragons, Carlos and Penelope, who are both creatures in the veil. And, Los is Los the chameleon dragon, and Penelope is Lady Penelope, a white deer who leads the Aubain faction later on in the series, and who doesn't love their pets to live on forever in some way, shape, or form. And mine now get to do that in the veil. So I have them running around all the time, and they're always sources of inspiration in some way, shape, or form, which I kind of love. But it's always, something new is always kind of going on, and I'm still writing more books to the series, more novellas, and then designing things for it. And then I make a lot of the armor for my cosplayer for the covers, which the Four Horsemen, my publishers, decided to put me on after they saw my cosplay as the characters. They were kind of like, what are you doing with these pictures? And I really didn't know. I was just holding on to them because I was just experimenting as the characters, just to figure out, would this character wear a cape? Does it work when they fight? Little things like that. And they were like, well, we're going to throw you on the cover. So lo and behold, I became, as they call me, the next Fabio of fantasy, as a joke. And it kind of stuck, which is, hats off to the Four Horsemen for taking that risk to put an author on the cover of a book that's not a biography or nonfiction. There's not many, that could say, oh yeah, I'm on the cover of my book. That's great. I was really I was flattered. I was scared out of my mind, but it worked out. It's great. So every day is different, which is awesome. But I'm also always doing research because I think a lot of people don't think fiction books, especially fantasy, has research involved. You think about that for nonfiction, obviously, for historical books, and maybe for historical fiction, people will think there's some research involved. But for fantasy, no, there's just as much research. If you're going to build a map, you have to start thinking about, okay, where's the bodies of water? Where's your mountain ranges? What are you going to name them? What languages? All those things, they go into your book. If you want to write a good one, if you want to have a system, all of that has to be discovered. You have to build it from the ground up. There's no existing system. There's no existing mountain range. You have to turn around and figure out, where am I going to put this? Who lives there? What kind of creatures live there? That all has to be figured out. So that takes a while. And that's where some of my time goes to. Good portion of my time, depending on where you're at in your series or where I'm at in my series at that point.
And that's research. It's funny. I was thinking when you were saying about calling it research, it makes a lot of sense because you're researching into what your world actually is. But at the same time, it's something that is not there, so you're creating it. So you're sort of exploring your own creation in that sense, right?
Yes. It's an odd thing because you're creating it, you're the architect, you're the world builder, but you're doing research at the same time because as you're creating these creatures, you have to think about, where do they live? What's the climate? What did I just make? If you made, I have the speleons, which are cave-dwelling gnomes in my world, and their skin secretes this acid where they're able to mine and then kind of shape crystal, but they don't love living above ground. So I had to sit there and think, okay, what are they going to look like? Well, where are they going to live in the Vale? So it was like, all right, how tall are they? Because they're living underground. So they're not going to be these big, tall creatures. Because if they're living underground and they have to create their habitat, do I make them tall? No, not because they're not going to sit there and want to mine big, tall caverns. That's not really what they do. So all that goes into play. All right, well, do they have hair? Do they not have hair? Well, okay, if they don't have hair, then how do they identify their factions or their kin? Do I have tattoos? Those things all start playing in your head. Is it warm? Is it cold? Do they live, closer to a volcano where maybe it's hot, it's warmer, so I don't have to worry about hair so much? Like things that you wouldn't think of how much research you would do, those things starts playing in your head. Because originally I was like, okay, they're gnomes, done. And then I was like, oh, it's not that easy. All right, how big are their eyes? Because they're living underground. It's stuff that originally when I started this, I didn't think I'd have to get that into. But as you start writing, believe me, the readers, they'll start asking you these questions and you better have an answer because they will ask and you need to know and you have to know your world because at the end of the day, you created it, you walk it. If you don't know it, they're going to want to know the answers. And if you don't have them, they will make it up for you. So you have to do it.
I'm guessing there's a lot of inspiration. At least I am a fan of Tolkien as well, and how he created worlds and languages and all sorts of things. And I'm guessing that sort of I read his biography as well, and that was sort of, it's not only about writing the pages that you're going through, but actually, as you were saying, doing that sort of research of what are all these creatures going to be looking like, right? So I'm guessing that either that or some of I heard at some point, I don't know if this makes sense or not, to be honest, I didn't research it at all, but that at least half or more of the fantasy worlds that are created have some form, even if distant, of a derivative of what this guy created back in the 20s or the 30s. So quite a long while ago.
I'm sure there is some truth to that. I can't specifically say. I don't know. Even the creatures I've created, I think we're all joined in some way, shape, or form to Tolkien. My gnomes probably go back to him in some way. We're probably distant relatives. Somehow my gnomes could probably be like, oh, I know him. I'm not sure. But you try to be original, but even your originality,
of course,
it's kind of like Ancestry.com. I wish we had an ancestry for Tolkien and we could go back and kind of figure it all out. But it's interesting how it all comes to be. I have dryads. My dryads are probably 100%, I should say they're probably 90% different from someone else's dryads who may have taken a literal translation of the dryads from somebody else. You know, we're all a little bit of a derivative of somebody. But then my white deer, my Aubain faction of deer are different than someone else. You know, there's a lot of people that are like, oh, the deer are the spirit animals of the forest. My white deer are different, you know, than someone else's. And we just kind of keep going off. Now, my mermaids are different, and it's kind of funny. I forgot to put, when I did the chests, I forgot nipples. I just totally forgot them. I don't know how I did that. And I was describing them, and then I was literally halfway through book 2 when I went, I forgot the nipples. And it was one of those moments where I was like, they don't have nipples. And I stopped, and I remember turning to my editor at the time, and she was like, you don't have nipples. And I said, no. I was like, I don't know why. I just forgot them. And she's like, and what are you going to do about it? And I sat there and I went, well, they don't spawn. They are not capable of birthing children, offspring. I said, so that's why they don't have nipples. And she just looked at me. She went, okay. She's like, I'm not even going to argue with you on this. She's like, because I don't know how you forgot those. And I said, because I was so worried about giving them this defense mechanism of when they swim, their skin is able to reflect the water pattern. So they blend into the water. That was all I was worried about, that I just forgot basic anatomy. And so it's like you make some of these mistakes and you're just like, gosh, you know, how do you forget that stuff? But, you know, you get caught up in trying to make your stuff different because everybody's seen a mermaid. Like we all know, you know, it's one of those things where it's like we kind of all know what this is. That you're like, mine's going to be different. And this is how it's going to be different. That then you wind up making a dumb mistake like that. And I was like, you know, I'll figure this out. So,
sure. And actually that sort of blends into one of the first questions I was going to make about a time where you set out to do something and there was some form of a failure. And there you have it. You forgot the nipples and you came out of it, you know, creatively and realizing some things, you came out of it as well.
Yeah, I was able to turn it around, but you know, those things happen and you just kind of go, all right, I'm not going to go back and rewrite something. So you just kind of go, all right, well, it happens and move along.
There you go. So actually spinning it around and going for actually a time where, you know, you set out to do something, it actually ended up being a massive success. And here perhaps I'm going to pinch you into that origin story of the creation of these whole worlds. Maybe that could be an interesting place to go to, because I'm sure the listeners by now are expecting to hear some of that.
My origin story is quite different. Let me preface it by saying first, everybody, I'm not a classically trained author. I'm sure you guys have all figured that out by now. So, you know, let's start with that. I was working as a nurse in a Lyme disease clinic. When I say clinic, it was the basement of the doctor's house. So once again, everything about this is unorthodox. And we had IV drips every day. So these patients dripped Monday through Sunday, 7 days a week. And I had a patient who I became very close with. I started the job. He started his drip on the same day. So we were walking this world hand in hand pretty much. And he just didn't want to do it anymore. He had moved his life up from Pennsylvania, which was 5 hours away, to New York. So he had just kind of said, all right, I'm going to do this. I want to be cured or feel better at the very least. And after months of this, almost a year at this point, he was just kind of done. So one day he just said to me, you know, Danny, I don't want to do this anymore. So we struck a deal with the doctor where he said, I'm going to go back to work. I'm going to drive home. And then on Wednesdays, I'm going to drive 5 hours, drip for 2 hours, turn around and drive home. And then I'll return on Friday and I'll stay Friday, Saturday, Sunday, and go home Monday. And after some convincing, the doctor said, all right, fine. I knew this wasn't going to last. This lasted maybe 2 or 3 weeks, and he finally said, I don't want to do this. I'm done. Bad idea. And we were talking, and I said, if you stop, you'll backslide. He said, well, then you better do something to keep me in this chair, because I can't do it. He said, tell me a story, make some jokes. I don't know, do something. So I said, well, tell me something interesting about your life. We made some jokes, and he said, well, I was recruited by the CIA out of college. And I was like, how did I not know this for a year? And once again, we joked about how if he had taken the job, we could have found out what was in Roswell, you know, what happened in Roswell, Area 51. And he said, no, I was recruited by the Trends and Intentions Division for the CIA, which was basically just an analyst. And he's like, the most boring division. I didn't take it, and I wound up here. So I said, well, you know where Lyme disease came from, and conspiracy theories abound. We made some jokes. And out of my mouth to this day, I don't know what made me say it. I said, no, Lyme disease is from the Fae. I wasn't reading any books about the Fae. I just popped out of my mouth. And he kind of leaned back and he said, who are the Fae? And I said, oh, come on, a big CIA man like you know what the Fae are about. And I said, you're really here because you want to find out if the nurse is the brains behind this whole Lyme disease operation. And you want to know if she's a Fae-human hybrid. And he kind of looked at me. He went, yeah, that's why I'm here. So I put him into the story, made him the CIA agent, made me the Fae-human hybrid nurse, started telling him this story. And then he said, well, tell me more about the Fae. And I said, well, they were angels who were locked out of heaven between the war between God and Lucifer. And they didn't get involved. And I started just weaving this story. And every time he sat down in the chair, I'd tell him another chapter of it. Just off the top of my head, I'd make stuff up. Anything that happened in the IV room when the doctor's big black dog walked in, I would say that was a dragon. And this is what would happen. And so every day, told him a new chapter. And he would sit and listen to me. And I would throw him in the story and make him the CIA agent. And we would just keep going back and forth on these stories. And that's how the whole thing came to be. And he was like, you need to go home and write this down. He's like, I don't know what you're doing after work, but go home and write down what you just told me. And I was like, dude, I'm going to PA school. I'm going to go make me some money. I don't have time to be an author. I have plans. And he was like, no, you need to go write this down. I'm telling you, you're making a mistake. Go write this down. And after him poking and prodding at me to go write this story down, and after some other things that happened, I took his advice and started writing these stories down. And lo and behold, it became a whole fantasy book and then a series. And it just kept going. And I kept writing it all down. And he was my biggest cheerleader. And to this day, we still speak 2 or 3 times a week. And he became the inspiration for Agent Graham in what will be book 7 of the Birth of the Fae series. And that's how it started.
Nice. Very interesting. And there it was, as we were discussing the pre-interview chat, that was kind of world building with a purpose, I think is what we were sort of coining it at that point. I don't know if you've said that before, but that's the way we were referring to it. And I love it because we are here usually, like most of our guests are all about, either creating games or using things like gamification to do something like the game is, games tend to be for entertainment, and entertainment is great. It's a very important industry. I do think that all of us need some form of entertainment and hobbies and all these things. So they have a very important human sort of experience in general. But, when you have a purpose, something that goes sort of beyond that entertainment, it can be like super, super powerful. And that's what we typically talk about. And here it's very related. Like many of the games that are created, many of the gamification, they create a world for it, whether, a little bit superficial or super deep, depending on what it's all about. And that's the reason why we have you here. And I love your origin story in that sense. And, how that has led you to this whole career. And are you sort of full-time on this? Are you still doing some nursing? How's that going for you?
I'm full-time on this. It just evolved, and it kind of happened in just one of those ways where the universe started throwing pebbles at me. And then when I kept going, no, I'm going to PA school. I'm going to do this. I'm going to keep going with health career. It was like, here's a boulder. It was like a rock and then a boulder. And I'm like, oh, okay, I'm supposed to be doing this. Got it. So I am doing this now full time. The 4 Horsemen Publications picked me up, and they were like, no, we need more books. And so they have me on a very strict writing schedule. I have novellas. I have oracle cards coming out, different things. So my world is pretty much the Veil, and that's what I do. And I love it. Don't get me wrong. I completely love it. It's allowed me to really delve into this. But from where I started in that little IV room, talking to my patient and as, the dog would walk in and I'm like, oh, and the Dark Fae King had a big black dragon, to now having a poster of Dragor and everything that went into creating my dragons. It's night and day. I mean, you want to talk research. I had to talk to a veterinarian about it. I talked to a mechanical engineer, a physics professor. my dragons, their whole culmination and their origin themselves was actually a community college engineering departments. They were their midterm exam. So, I mean, imagine I walked into Westchester Community College, met with the physics professor and the mechanical engineering professor, and explained to them, I want dragons that if they were on Mythbusters, they would be plausible. And said, I want them to fly based on the albatross theory of, thermals. I said, here are the measurements. What can we do? And they wound up giving presentations for their midterm exams on my dragons and if they would fly.
If they would actually fly, right?
Yeah, if you could get my
fire.
dragons to fly. For fire, ice, and acid, I actually worked with a veterinarian. I worked with Dr. Gil Stanzione of Dakota Veterinarian. I went in with him. He was my dog's vet. And I said, I have a theory on these 3 oral defenses for dragons. And he was like, I remember he looked at me, he went, oh God, Danielle. And he put his head down. And I said, I need to get them to breathe fire, ice, or acid. And he went, Danielle, it's dragons. I said, hear me out. I'm like, what if I build it from the digestive system out? And I remember he took his glasses off and he went, before I answer you. And I was like, yeah. He goes, what is this for? And I was like, it's for my book. I'm like, just go with me on this. And he went, I'm listening. And he said, the digestive system. I said, based on bacteria. And he actually stopped and he went, I can't believe I'm about to say this. He went, it's actually not a bad idea. And I brought out little index cards and I said, here's fire, here's ice, here's acid. And he looked at it and he picked it up. He went, I can't believe I'm going to say this to you again. He goes, he's like, this is plausible. And I went, all right, I'm going to stop you there. He went, no, give me the next one. And I kept giving him more information. He went, Danielle, this is actually good. And I was like, really? He went, this isn't bad. He's like, now I'm not telling you go build a dragon or anything. He's like, I'm just saying based on these bacteria, yeah, they would give off these gases. He goes, yep, they'll give off methane. Yes, it'll give off hydrogen. He's like, okay, yeah, he's like, these are combustible. He's like, you're right. And I went, okay, that's my fire one. He went, all right, give me the next. And I'm like, here's my acid. And he looked at it and he went, you're building this off the Komodo dragon. He went, all right. He goes, you're going to pump it through. He went, this isn't bad. He goes, you got a fistula under the tongue. He went, all right. He goes, and he just looked at me. He went, you got something here. And I was like, I could make, he goes, all right, give me the next one. And I did. And he went, and he looked at me. He went, you got a gizzard. He said, you base this off a bird. And I went, yeah. And he was like, draw him up and bring it back. And I did. And we sat and we figured out the digestive system of all 3 of them. And he was like, he turned around, he went, you got extra parietal cells. And he's like, I like it. And so we figured out all the dragons, but the dragons took 9 months to build.
Wow. From
the flight to the digestive system. And by the end of it, my dragons are not the size of 747s, first of all, by any means. So Neil, deGrasse Tyson, DeCross, whatever, don't come after me. They're not that big. Don't start getting all physics on me, honey. It's not that big. They're smaller dragons, but yeah, we figured it out. We figured out exactly how a chameleon changes, the way the electric current kind of changes over the body to shorten the distance between cells. So the wavelength changes and what the eye sees. And we did all of that. So my dragons, the world building just in the dragon society took, from anatomy and physiology to the end result of the dragons in their society took, 9 months beginning to end.
Wow.
They were my longest because I wanted dragons, even from a gaming perspective, we always see dragons in fantasy, but either tools of mass destruction, villains, or somebody's pet. They're never their own being. And I wanted them to have a little more respect. And after I talked about him so much to my patient, I was like, geez, I got to make this dragon like something good. So, I talked a really good game and I was like, Graham, now I got to really do something about it. And then I found a great dragon illustrator, Pandy Van, on DeviantArt. And she drew them all up. And she used my little Yorkie as a model for Los and got everything down to his extra long tongue that hangs out of his mouth all the time. And we drew it all up.
So Danielle, actually, let me pause you there because one of the things that I wanted to understand is when you're thinking of building that world, or actually, it's a world that you're working on that's already sort of built and it just keeps on building on itself. How do you go about it? Because you were mentioning that you went and you had these meetings with the vet and you had these things. Like, how does that go? Do you have some form of, I'm not sure if I want to call it a process, but it kind of is, right? Of how do you come up with these ideas, or how do you validate them, or how do you do all this stuff? Like, how does that happen?
Depends on what I'm working on. When I was working on my dragons, I knew I was going to have dragons, so I spent a lot of time developing them, and I had to take it more from a medical nursing perspective for me personally. It just felt better to envision them and have them drawn, but I wanted to be like, okay, if I'm going to have oral defenses such as fire, I didn't want it to just be magical and be like, oh, they fly and they spew fire. Done. It's magic. I was like, no, there's got to be a logic to it. There's got to be steps. Why do they breathe fire? There's got to be a physiological reason that these dragons breathe fire. It can't just be that they're magical and let's just accept that as the answer, because I think it's a little bit of a cop-out, and it's been done so much. You know, you can't just see their throat like light up and we just accept, oh, they have fire in their belly. That's it. And like, let me go a little deeper, because for me as a writer, now I have a reason. It helps me write that better. So that was the dragons. For the rest of it, as I wrote the story, I handwrite everything first. So all the books have been handwritten first. Then I go to the computer, and that's where the first set of edits are done. As I'm typing it out, or even as I'm handwriting it, whatever I'm doing, as I'm doing that, it helps me to visualize, okay, they're in the Vale. They're in the Foralina forest. Well, what does the forest look like? Let me figure this out and get the landscape down and start building it up or building it out a little bit, because then I can kind of picture who's there. So I have to go and research if I want the Foralina forest to look like a bunch of tall lilac trees. And I know everybody's like, lilacs are bushes. Well, in my world, they're big trees. So let me go and see what the closest thing I can find picture-wise to that would look like. And then I create kind of like a mood board, you know, or I'll make a slate that has trees that kind of look like what I want it to look like. And sometimes I'll go find an illustrator and say, I need you to draw this landscape out. And then I have it. And I'm like, that's my Foralina forest. And I kind of put it up on the board. This is where, you know, the Bridge of Yorkie is. Okay, I've got that. What goes on here? Is this my neutral Fae territory? Where is this? And I kind of create a little story in my head of what goes on here. And then I keep moving on and building out that map. And I figure out who's where and what the little stories are in that. And I might just put a little sticky note on it. Like, here are the factions that live here. And I create my author index. Here's what goes on in the Foralina forest. Here's what goes on in the Sacred Grove. Here are the trees. Here are the factions, light Fae, dark Fae, whatever. And I just continue to build the map out as the story grows. And then I can kind of add more color to the story.
Nice. It seems like a very interesting way of approaching it. And given, of course, you were mentioning all of this of the vet, and for a second I did forget that you came from a sort of medical background, being a nurse. It was like, well, how did you get into all of these depths? And of course, you did have an advantage there. And that's where you never know where your background is actually going to lead you, your area of expertise. Sometimes you say, oh, why did I study this? And you know, I lost my time, but you know, being an author of fairies and these fantasy books, you're actually using your medical expertise in there. So it's interesting how things sort of come around. They say like, oh, you know, like, I don't know, like the guy of Apple, he was doing typography before starting Apple, and that's what kind of led him to these beautiful fonts and all that stuff. There's always ways in which our background is going to lead our curiosity and some of the things that we're able to do. So I find that super, super interesting from your ideas as well. And all that process that you sort of go deep into that. I'm guessing as well, like from deepening into each of the characters and the dragons and all of this, you then sort of like to get deep into all these things and create this very detailed world, which is in the end exactly where we are heading in. And before we move on to the sort of final questions, I know you mentioned you're doing some form of a game related to your world.
Right now, we've worked out the treatments for it, but we're working on a game based on a scene in the book where Los steals the crystal from book 1, Locked Out of Heaven, and he's got to get it from a room in the palace where he's just observed a spell, and he's got to take the crystal, which he's harnessed a bunch of magic, and get it back to Bloodhaven, the home of the Dark Fae. So we're working on we've developed, like I said, the treatment, what's going to happen, and we want it to be a mobile app game. We've talked to some investors, and we're still in talks with some others, but we're in the process of it. We've actually done some sketches of it already, and shows Los flying through the Foralina forest. But the goal of the game is you have to get the crystal back to King Jarvok safely. And there's a bunch of people, bunch of Fae trying to stop Los, but he can use his stealth skills, his chameleon blending skills to get it back to King Jarvok. And other dragons you can kind of toss the crystal to and get it back there, and you kind of get to explore the entire map of the Vale. So it'll give you a chance to see it, and then you can unlock some pages from the book and kind of a graphic novel of the book at the same time, and learn a little bit more about the Vale and about Los himself and where he's come from and the other dragons.
Neat. Are you, because I'm guessing you have all these things that are coming from your world, but there's also sort of the game design side of things. Are you doing that yourself? Are you working with somebody?
We have 2 places that we'd like to work with that we've already spoken to. So we're kind of looking at that. And then we have a possible console game based on a novella that's coming out with the dragons that would be kind of Mortal Kombat meets Dodgeball. The best way I can describe it without giving away too much, but a dragon tournament that would have more synergistic and dynamic play. So you would work in tandem with a pair, and you could be a Fae rider or a dragon, or you could be both and play against a team. So it's
nice.
It's definitely different. We've had a lot of people that are like, you need to do that game. So we're definitely talking to some people, and they'd like to see it. But as you know, console games take a long time to develop. So we're going to start with the app game with Los, and anything that can star my Yorkie. I mean, I'll never be able to live with him. He'll be a pain as it is. He thinks he's the star of everything, but that's okay. We're good with that. But it would be, that's kind of our goal. And anything that allows people to explore the Vale from different angles and introduces us to a new audience, I think is always a good thing. And I think fantasy just lends itself to gaming.
It certainly does. So, Danielle, I mean, final few questions. I mean, after hearing this and understanding a little bit more of what we get into, and the whole gamification, creation of things again with a purpose. In your case, the purpose was sort of helping this patient stay in their seat and do what they had to do to get better. Is there anybody that comes to your mind that you would say, oh, this person could be super interesting answering sort of similar questions to these and helping out the audience, the engagers?
I think anytime you can talk to any other artist, it's always interesting. I love comic books, so I'm always into talking to other comic book artists. I think that's always something that I think anybody who creates is interesting. I know AWA has just started their own company that allows artists to retain their rights to their creations. I know like Mike Deodato's with it, and he had an amazing run on the Avengers, on Batman, on Wonder Woman. I think he's a phenomenal artist. So I think that would be somebody really interesting to talk to. I think he's great. And the people that are running AWA, I think they would be really cool to talk to, because they're all about the creative movement and moving it forward to help artists retain their rights. So it's, in the comic book industry. So I think that'd be really cool, because they're a lot about world building and creating things from the ground up.
Sounds very neat. Very good recommendation. And Danielle, of course, next to your 3 books, or I don't know if there's actually even more, but next to your books, is there any book that you would recommend the engagers to read for gathering inspiration, understanding, I don't know, maybe world building?
Besides Tolkien, which I think should be that should be something you have to read if you're going to do it. If you want to write, I think The Emotional Thesaurus should be on every author's desk, or any content builder. If you're going to eat gaming or whatever, I think that's a great book to have in general. I also believe Anne Rice, The Interview with a Vampire, I think the point of view changes in that book in particular is very interesting for anybody who does gaming, does RPG kind of thing. I think it's a really interesting book to look at, because the way it shifts from Daniel to Luis's telling and flashback sequences, I think if you really look at it, it's very interesting. And as weird as this is going to sound, don't roll your eyes out there, guys. If you watch the TV show Scrubs, there's an episode where JD taps people's shoulders, and then they go and tap each other's shoulders, and it gives a different point of view change. It's a really good lesson in head hopping if you're a writer. and what head hopping is when you constantly change a point of view. I think it's a great demonstration of it for anybody who wants to start writing and they don't understand when you head hop versus when you change a point of view. So I think Scrubs is actually a very smart way to show that point of view change.
Interesting. Thanks for all of that inspiration, Danielle. And before we take off, Danielle, we always like to leave sort of a little bit of space for you to say any final words, of course, where we can find out more about you, about your books, about your worlds that you've created and you're continue to create for sure, before we say goodbye.
You can always keep up with me on Instagram at Birth of the Fae _novel, and on my website at birthofthefae.com, at horsemenpublications.com. They have an author space, and you can kind of check out what I've got going on. And then all my books can be found on Amazon.com, BarnesandNobles.com, and bookshop.org, where a larger portion of the proceeds of the books you buy go to actually support your local bookshops, which I think is a really great cause. And then on May 30th, my next book drops, Kingdom Come, from the Birth of the Fae series, which will be book 4. And then I have my first novella, which is based on my dragons, coming out over the summer, which I'm pretty darn excited about. And we'll see what else the Fae have going on. I never know. I have an Oracle card series coming out later this year, probably toward the end of the year. And that'll feature all my great Fae characters. And even my father is going to be dressing up as one of the Fae for me and starring in that Oracle card series. So I'm kind of excited that I've got my dad dressing up. So, there's a lot going on with the Fae.
It does sound like it. Definitely good to keep up with all the exciting stuff that is going on. Again, engagers, sometimes even just for the inspiration, the whole world building that is out there. Of course, definitely to have a good time as well, reading some cool books. I do recommend you to take a look at that and see, all the things that are happening in the Fae, in the Baal as well. So thanks again, Danielle, for investing this time with us together here on Professor Game with the Engagers. Thanks for, pouring all of that knowledge, all of that experience you have in world building, and even now starting into games as well. However, at least for now and for today, it is time to say that it's game over. Engagers, it is fantastic to have you here, and this podcast makes sense thanks to you. So let's go ahead and connect. For example, how about we do it on Twitter? That way you can let me know who you want to have as a guest, what questions do you have, what perhaps we can help you as an engager with. You can find my Twitter account on professorgame.com/Twitter. I'm always sharing content about the podcast, about gamification, and of course around the world of education. I'm replying to messages as well. And hey, don't click continue yet. Remember, please, to go ahead and subscribe or follow for free using your favorite podcast app and listen to the next episode of Professor Game. See you there.